Back, and our next speaker is Meyns, who is working for the New Directions Study of Mind project. And Chris is going to talk to us about extended souls.
Thank you. Okay, I'll start with a question for you. So, when I'm thinking, where does my thinking process take place, would you say?
There.
So I think the most common answer to that question would be to say it's the brain. Like, my thinking takes place in my brain. You can also be a bit more liberal about that and say my thinking takes place in my body, and I think when I act and move throughout the space. Or you can even be yet more liberal and say, well, it's my environment with which I think. So my phone thinks for me. But whichever answer you give, like even if you give that first, most specific answer that it's the brain with which I think, then still you get the results that my thinking process is spatially extended. And that's a contentious point. Now what I want to do today is look at a parallel debate in the early modern period. Specifically, what I want to look at is arguments by 17th century authors such as René Descartes, Henry Moore, and Thomas Hobbes. And yes, by the way, there is a handout, it's distributed on the table. And if you can't find it on the table, it's on the internet at bit.ly/extended-soul. Okay, so there you can find the quotations. So I want to look at 17th century authors relating to debates about this question whether thinking is extended. But specifically, what I want to look at for these authors is whether they think that souls can have spatial extension. And the question that I'm asking in this debate is, what drives the debate about whether souls can have spatial extension or not? So what makes it that people go either one way and say, yes, they do have spatial extension, or go the other way and say, no, souls can't be extended in space? And what I want to argue is that it's not exclusively or even primarily to do with how authors in this period think about the nature of the soul. But what I want to suggest is that to a very important extent, this depends on how these authors think about the nature of space. But first, to begin with, why would someone think that souls have spatial extension in the first place? So why would you even entertain that thought? Well, here's what I call a basic piece of reasoning, which is on your handout. So we start with the observation as the first premise that soul acts throughout the body. So if you're happy with the idea that there are souls, then you might say that when I raise my arm, my soul initiates that act of raising the arm. When I perceive something, my soul is operated in my eye and maybe part of my brain. So we observe that soul acts throughout the body. Second observation, second premise, things are where they act. Now, what can motivate someone to accept this point is a denial that there is such a thing as action at a distance. So if you think that things aren't able to act where they're not, then you'll accept this point that things are located where they act. But from those two basic observations, we can very easily get to the conclusion, which here is as a third point, that soul extends throughout the body. But this point is contested also in early modern philosophy. And we can find authors both going in favor of this claim and say, yes, souls do have spatial extension, or they do extend throughout the body, and authors who say, no, it's not the case. Souls do not have spatial extension. They don't operate throughout the body. On the one side, we can find an author like René Descartes. Descartes rejects the idea that souls extend in space. And this comes out in the first quotation on your handout. Descartes says, I deny that true extension, as it is commonly conceived by everyone, is to be found in God, or in angels, or in our mind, or or in any substance that is not a body. For Descartes, this is backed by wider observations, or it's a statement he makes in his wider framework of metaphysics, specifically with wider assumptions he has about what souls are, or the nature of the soul. And this comes out in the second quotation on your handout. Descartes says, each substance has one principal property which constitutes its nature and essence, and to which all its other properties are referred. Thus, extension in length, breadth, and depth constitutes the nature of corporeal substance, and thought constitutes the nature of thinking substance. So what you see here is that for Descartes, because it's the case that each substance has just one principal property which defines its nature and what it is, its principal attributes, and Descartes has further reasons to think that that is the case, that each thing has one principal property. And because he identifies that the property of the soul is that of thinking, then it can't be the case that the property of the principal property of the soul is also that of extension. So Descartes' conclusion is that souls do not, of their nature, extend in space. Not everyone agrees with that conclusion. For example, here's Thomas Hobbes, who says, yes, it is the case that souls have spatial extension. This is the third text in your handout, where Hobbes says, the world is corporeal, that is to say, body, and has the dimensions of magnitude, namely length, breadth, and depth. Also, every part of body is likewise body, and hath the like dimensions. And consequently, every part of the universe is body, and that which is not body is not part of the universe. And because the universe is all, that which is not part of it is nothing, and consequently nowhere. Nor does it follow that from hence that spirits are nothing, for they have dimensions, and are therefore really bodies. So Hobbes' suggestion is that whatever is part of the universe, it must have a location and it must have dimensions with which it extends. And Hobbes emphasizes this as a very general principle in metaphysics. So if something exists, then it will be part of the universe, it will have a location, and therefore it will have extension. And this also comes out, this general principle comes out in the set of objections that Hobbes writes in response to Descartes' book, The Meditations. Because there Hobbes says, this is text 4 in your handout, what is nowhere does not exist. Therefore, it has no being, or nature of any kind. So this is a very general principle. Whatever exists must be somewhere, it must have a being or nature, it also must have some extension. So this gets us to a very basic opposition. Someone like Descartes who says, no, souls don't have spatial extension, they can't have spatial extension. And on the other hand, someone like Hobbes who says, they do, they must have spatial extension in order to be part of the universe at all. So we get this very basic opposition, and although these people are in dialogue with one another, like they write objections and responses, it doesn't seem that we're cooking a lot of progress in the dialogue. Because, for example, when Hobbes and Descartes have their exchange about Descartes' work, The Meditations, Hobbes suggests that Descartes draws all kinds of unfounded, unsupported conclusions, such as the conclusion that he's a thinking thing. Whereas from Descartes' perspective, it looks like Hobbes is just denying some very basic points or basic principles of the metaphysics that he has just presented. It looks like Hobbes is just denying that there could be souls in the first place. And in this exchange, Descartes also gets quite rude in response to Hobbes. So he says something like, well, I've read all the objections that you've written, but I haven't found a single valid inference in all of what you're saying. So, yes, we've got these two opposing positions, but it doesn't look like there is much progress in going through them. So if that's right, then it looks like you could think that we here just have a basic standoff, that it just depends on whether you accept extended souls as basic part of your ontology or whether you're not happy to do that. So that could be a diagnosis of what's going on here. But I want to offer a different suggestion. So one different diagnosis that doesn't say, well, it's just a basic part of their ontology, would be to say that it has to do, the divergence really has to do with this thing, namely how authors think about the nature of the soul. And in particular, whether authors think of the soul as something that is bodily or corporeal, or whether they think of the soul as something that's not bodily or immaterial, incorporeal. And the reason I would suggest that this is an attractive or well-supported inference or diagnosis is that if we go back to the statements I gave of Descartes and Hobbes, you can see that this concern about whether the soul is a body or is not a body, it's a big issue for them. It comes up in the considerations that they offer. Because for Descartes, precisely the fact that the soul is incorporeal and that in its nature it's wholly distinct from anything to do with body, that brings him to the conclusion that the soul is not extended. And for Hobbes, on the other hand, core part of Hobbes' reasoning is that the soul is corporeal, it is a body, and with that fact, we must conclude that it also has these dimensions, that it has spatial extension. So I think this is a well-supported diagnosis, and we can maybe capture this in a general principle, such as this idea. The idea could be that if you think of the soul as bodily or as corporeal, then you'll get the conclusion that the soul is indeed also extended. But if, on the other hand, you accept that the soul is not corporeal or immaterial, then we'll get the conclusion that the soul is not extended, that it can't have extension in space. So then the idea of this diagnosis is, it's really a disagreement about the nature of the soul, how authors think that the soul is either bodily or not bodily. That really drives the divergence in this debate about extended souls. Now, what I want to say is that, yes, it is an attractive diagnosis, and there's also some support for it. But it can't be the right story. It can't be all that is to say about this puzzle. And the reason for that is that not everyone in these circles who thinks that the soul is extended also thinks of the soul as material or corporeal or as a body. Certain people in this debate accept that there can be immaterial souls which also have spatial extension. And one of the main proponents of this idea is, in the 17th century, is the Cambridge-based philosopher Henry More, who lived around here hundreds of years ago. So Henry More says the following, which is quote 5 on your handout. He says, "From what I have said, I will evince with the certainty of mathematics the result that God and our soul, and thus all other immaterial things, are in some way extended." And elsewhere, More also gives a characterization of what this would involve. He says, text 6 on your handout, "The notion of spirit, or incorporeal, implies no contradiction." And here he's talking to people like Thomas Hobbes who think that there just can't be immaterial things, that involves a contradiction. More's idea is the notion of spirit involves no contradiction. There being nothing understood thereby but extended substance with activity and indiscernibility, which is indivisibility, leaving out impenetrability. So More's idea of a spirit or an incorporeal being is that it's extended, it is active, you can't divide it up, and it's penetrable in the sense that spirits can penetrate bodies and can overlap with bodies. That's More's idea of an incorporeal substance. So More accepts that there are souls which are incorporeal and also have spatial extension. And More doesn't just leave it as at such a statement. He also gives some reasoning for why this must be the case. So this is text 7 on your handout. More says, it being of the very essence of whatsoever is to have parts or extension in some measure or other. For to take away all extension is to reduce a thing only to a mathematical point, which is nothing else but pure negation or non-entity. And there being no medium betwixt extended and not extended, no more than there is betwixt entity and non-entity, it is plain that if a thing be at all, it must be extended. So here you can see that More too gives a very general principle, or a very general line of reasoning, akin to what we saw in Hobbes, that if something exists, if it is part of the universe, then it must have some extension. Now, the availability or the presence of More's position throws a different light on the disagreement between these various authors that I sketched before. Because what it means is that we can't just capture the debate between people who disagree about whether there are extended souls as being purely different, a disagreement about the nature of the soul and whether the soul is something bodily or not bodily. And this is because whether you think of the soul as material or immaterial, it doesn't yet give you a conclusion about whether you must accept that souls are extended or not extended. Because there is the option of thinking of souls as immaterial and not extended, or thinking of them as immaterial and still having some spatial extension. And another way it illuminates that prior debate is that what we can see More do here is, he says against Descartes that souls must have some spatial extension. And in that respect, what More is saying is sort of similar to what we saw in Hobbes. But if you are Descartes, then unlike was the case with Hobbes, Descartes can't just dismiss what More is saying by saying, well, you just don't believe that there are immaterial souls. Maybe to Hobbes he could say that, but he can't say that to Henry More, because Henry More does think that there are immaterial souls, and still accepts that souls have spatial extension. Now, if Descartes can't dismiss More's position in this way, then potentially what More is doing could pose some serious threat to the Cartesian framework. So it could make a serious challenge to Descartes. So let me explicate how that challenge would work. So originally, when he started writing, Henry More was actually a big fan of Cartesian philosophy. He was a strong supporter of Descartes' work. But over the years, More got a bit worried about the philosophy that Descartes was proposing. And in particular, More worried about the fact that Descartes presented souls as immaterial and not extended. More worried that this picture would make souls so exceptional, or give them such a special exempt status, that there was the risk that souls would become unsuitable or unfit as objects of natural philosophical inquiry. So More's worry was that if we go this way, and in thinking about souls, then the new science will just throw souls out of the framework. And More was so worried about this that he thought that we should resist the idea that souls are immaterial and not extended, and instead accept that souls, while they're immaterial and while they are spiritual, still have spatial extension. Himmer also offers an argument for that conclusion. And the argument that he offers is directed at Descartes, in the way Moore interprets Descartes. And it's also directed at anyone who thinks that souls wouldn't have a location in space. So if you believe that souls don't have a location in space, then this argument is for you. And it's in quote 8 of the handout. Moore says this: for these no-placers, which is nulli vista in Latin, the idea that those who believe that souls don't have a place or a location, these no-placers acknowledge and claim the operations which the soul performs in the body to be in the body, and the divine power or force with which God acts in matter and moves it to be present in the singular parts of matter. Hence, it is easy to gather the operations of the soul and God's motive force to be somewhere, namely in body and in matter. And indeed, the operation of the soul that acts in the body, that same soul, and the divine power with which God moves matter, and God himself, are the same. They cannot, not even in thought, be separated from each other. So God can't be separated from the divine power, and souls can't be separated from their operations. Therefore, if the operation of the soul is somewhere, the soul is somewhere, namely there where the operation is. If the divine power of God is somewhere, God is somewhere, that is to say, there where the divine potency is. He in the singular parts of matter, the soul in the human body. But the reasoning that Henry Moore gives here is sort of similar to the simple piece of reasoning that I started out with in the beginning. So the idea is, first premise, the soul operates in the body. Second premise, things must be where they act. And here, in this piece of reasoning, it's supported by the idea that you can't separate the soul from its actions, or you can't separate God from God's actions. And then we get the conclusion that souls must be somewhere. And then, not explicated in this text, but in the background is the idea, if they're somewhere, then they're got to have extension. Now, Moore holds that this argument has force against a Cartesian, or against anyone who initially thought that souls don't have a location and aren't extended. Because Moore thinks that this argument forces a Cartesian or a no-placer to accept that souls do have an extension and do have a location. So we can assess it. Is this an effective argument, and should Descartes really be changing his mind? So here's a simple piece of reasoning again. Now, I suggest that Descartes is unlikely to reject the first premise. So he's unlikely to get to the conclusion that it's not the case that soul acts throughout the body. Even if Descartes doesn't want to say that the soul acts throughout the body, so that it would act in each individual part of the body, what Descartes would want to accept is that the soul acts on a certain part of the brain. He says so in his meditations and in his passions of the soul. So I don't think he would want to reject the first premise. Certain followers of Descartes, sometimes called occasionalists, they would be okay with rejecting the first premise. So they could say something like, it's not the case that that there is causal interaction between distinct substances. But I think for Descartes himself, this premise will stay. In some of his works, it appears that Descartes would want to reject the second premise. So the idea that things must be where they act, as a general principle. And one example of where Descartes could offer such resistance is in a letter that he writes to Henry More, where he says that God could act in a place and have an extension of power without God's nature being at that location or having a location being related to location or space in any way at all. So that would go against the idea that as a general principle, things must be where they act. It might be that this is a special case that only God is able to do it. So from this statement, it's not clear whether souls would also be considered an exception. But as a general principle, Descartes offers some resistance to this idea. And rejecting the second premise, for Descartes, it's not a minor thing to do for him to deny this. Because it does mean that we're back with the idea that there can be action at a distance. So it is possible for something to act from a location where it is not located. Maybe that's okay for God, maybe that's okay for souls too. But Descartes himself strongly wants to resist that this is possible for bodies. So it's he may want to reject this premise, but it's not a minor thing for him to give this up. In other places, it looks like Descartes could still accept the first premise, could also still accept the second premise, but deny the validity of the inference from those premises to the conclusion that soul extends throughout the body. And the thought here would be that a soul could be at a location or in a certain region without extending throughout that region. That might seem like a fancy metaphysical novelty, but the idea is that something similar could also be found, for example, for the case of heaviness. So the idea would be that the feature or the property of heaviness can belong to an entire thing or can belong to an entire region, without it being the case that at this particular point there is the property of heaviness and then it extends to the next point and to the next and to the next. So that's not an argument for why this must be so, but it might make it more palatable. But the idea that something could be spread out through a location without extending, be spread out through a region without extending in that region, it's been criticized. So it's, in any case, if Descartes wants to accept this idea, then there is some metaphysical work for him to do. Now, what all of these moves show is that, yeah, Descartes may have some room to resist the argument that Henry More is presenting. But it's not easy. It doesn't come on the cheap. If he rejects the second premise, there's some work to do. If he rejects the validity of the inference to the third, there's also some work to do. So you can't get it easy. You can't get the result easily that souls could act in a place or be in a place without extending in that place. So I think the fact that this doesn't come very cheaply, that may put some pressure on Descartes. But there's actually a bigger, more basic, fundamental challenge. Fundamental question about the challenge that Henry More is offering to Descartes. Because from Descartes' perspective, the idea would be, how can this option of immaterial extension, how can this get formulated in the first place? How can it even make sense for something which is immaterial to be extended? Because, for example, Descartes and Hobbes, they don't agree on many things, but they do agree on the idea that if something has extension, if it is extended, it must be a body. So how, More presents this challenge, but how can this category of immaterial extension, how can it even make sense? That is a question for More at this point. Now, I would offer a suggestion of a framework in which this can make sense, but it involves a shift in focus. So what I suggest is that we focus on this bit of the original question and focus on accounts of space, and in particular of what it is for something to extend in space to begin with, to have spatial extension. And I want to begin making the case for that by looking at some accounts of space that would have been available in the 17th century. So one way in which you might think of space is as something that exists of itself, independently of anything else, which can exist on its own. Maybe something like a container in which things can exist, but which can also potentially be empty if there aren't any objects in space. And this is a view of space which we would nowadays call substantivalism about space. On the other hand, a different way of thinking about space is as not an entity that can exist in and of itself or independently. And a specific version of that would be the idea that space is nothing over and above body or the massiveness or expansion of bodies. And this is what nowadays would be called relationalism about space. Now, I agree that it might be risky to use these contemporary categories to understand what is going on in the 17th century, but I want to say that if we apply it with some caution, then we can find these views of space also in the 17th century, or at least something close to it. For example, we can find something close to relationalism in the work of Descartes. And this can be found in the 9th page on your handout. Descartes says, there is no real distinction between space or internal place and the corporeal substance contained in it. The only difference lies in the way in which we are accustomed to conceive of them. For in reality, the extension in length, breadth, and depth, which constitutes a space, is exactly the same as that which constitutes body. So it's contested to what extent Descartes could actually stick to relationalism about space and keep that as his firm position. But from this statement, it's in any case clear that he's not a substantivalist about space and that he's closest to the option of relationalism. There's something close to substantivalism about space can be found in the work of Henry Moore. And Henry Moore is actually the first in the 17th century to develop this idea to a great extent. So Moore says the statement that I put in text 10 on your handout. He says, for if, after the removal of corporeal matter out of the world, there will still be space and distance in which this very matter, while it was there, was also conceived to lie. And this distant space cannot but be something, and yet not corporeal, because neither impenetrable nor tangible. It must of necessity be a substance incorporeal, necessarily and eternally existent of itself. Now, Moore develops this conception of space prior to Newton and also drawing on arguments independent of those that you find in Newtonian physics or Newtonian physics considerations. Okay, so let that stand then as an overview of at least two options of how people could conceive of space in this period. Now, what does all of this mean for what it is to extend in space, or the idea of extension? Well, here's a very basic minimal account of extension. The idea would be that if something is extended, then it must be greater than a single mathematical point. This is a very basic notion of extension, and I can formulate it without appealing to a specific view of space, just only considering extension. But what I want to suggest is that the view of space that you adopt in the background can affect or can have consequences for what you can say about what it is to have spatial extension. So here's what I want to propose. Relationalism, as I've explained it here, so relationalism about bodies, or the idea that space is nothing over and above body. Relationalism restricts what it is to be extended. And the reason for that is that because on this view, space isn't anything of itself or independently, but it's nothing over and above body or properties of body. Given that conception, what it is to extend in space, or space doesn't exist independently of body. So then what it is to have spatial extension, or all things that can have spatial extension, they must be bodies. Only bodily things, or only material things, can have spatial extension on this conception. So relationalism, I suggest, will move, or has to move, beyond this minimal conception of extension, as I presented it just a moment ago. But with substantivalism, things are different. Because on this view, space is an entity which exists of itself independently, so not dependent on things existing in space. And because of that, with substantivalism, or substantivalism doesn't need to come with a restriction on the range of things that can have spatial extension. If you are a substantivalist, you can allow both material and immaterial things to be extended. So here's a bit more in a general statement. I suggest that the substantivalist view of space, if you have that view in the background, then it becomes possible to say that immaterial things have spatial extension. Whereas if you have a relationalist view in the background, then you cannot accommodate immaterial things to be extended. That's the proposal. And what I want to suggest is that this clarifies how Henry Moore can even begin to present his challenge to Descartes. So the idea that how we can even begin to formulate the idea that immaterial things can be extended, how we can offer this as a genuine alternative and not just as a flat-out contradiction. Because whereas for Descartes' relationalism, it would make no sense to say that something could both be immaterial and extended. But with Moore's substantivalist conception of space, it does become a genuine option. It is not, the view or the category of immaterial extension is not in itself problematic. So that's how Moore can begin to offer this challenge as a genuine challenge to Descartes. And it's not that Moore just happened to have this view of space in the background as some sort of happy coincidence. In fact, Moore begins to develop this view of space precisely in order to make room for immaterial extended spirits. So in his Manual of Metaphysics, one point he makes is that to demonstrate that there can be space independent of body is a first step towards demonstrating the existence of incorporeal souls. So it's not just that these 2 points just happen to fit nicely together. He comes up with this conception precisely to facilitate immaterial extended souls. So my proposal is that in order to grasp the moves that are going on in this debate about extended souls, we can't stick with the idea of just looking at how these authors think about the nature of the soul and whether they think that the soul is a body or not a body. In order to understand the moves in this debate, we got to take account of how these people think about the nature of space. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Let's start cutting.